President Donald Trump says maybe it's not possible to reach a Russia-Ukraine peace deal. Now, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky says that a ceasefire with Russia in its more than 3-year-old war was possible at any moment and called on Kyiv's allies to apply greater pressure on Moscow to put the measures in place. Now, Zelensky, speaking at a joint news conference in Prague alongside Czech Republic's president, said that unless increased pressure was applied, Kremlin leader Vladimir Putin would take no real steps to end the conflict. Now, Putin last week had declared a 3-day ceasefire over May 8th to the 10th to mark the 80th anniversary of the victory of the Soviet Union and its allies over Nazi Germany in World War II. Now, Zelensky said such a measure is pointless and has called instead for an unconditional ceasefire for at least 30 days in line with the U.S. proposed launched in March. Right, we're joined now with Dr. Marek, who joins us via Zoom from London to discuss some of our top stories. Good evening, Dr. Marek. How are you doing this evening?
Good evening.
All right, so we've talked so much about the war and Gaza, but before we get into that, because that's always an interesting conversation with you, let's talk about the U.S. economy. Now, with 66% of Americans expressing fear or pessimism about the economy, what does this signal, in your opinion, about public confidence in President Trump's early economic leadership, considering that that's one of the reasons why very core Americans voted for him in the first place, you know, his history in business and just his capitalist views in general?
Yes, unfortunately, it's not very good reading for President Donald Trump, who has tried to shuffle the blame onto President Biden. But it is 100 days ago when President Biden was last president. And therefore, unfortunately, what the problems are of President Trump's own making. Although his plan to put tariffs on various countries in order to try and rebalance the trade deficit is not a bad one per se, and not impossible, although it has been condemned in that terms, that is incorrect. The problem is the way he implemented it. First and foremost, it was a blanket tariff and did not take into account that some countries, such as Australia, were actually trading at a loss with America. Secondly, and this is, I think, the fatal one, he suddenly, with China, having settled on one tariff, he then put it very, very high, and that was a mistake, because although his first tariff proposal was reasonable, the second one was absurd, over 100%. And then just to add to his problems, he suddenly withdrew yet again when the bonds market started to collapse. The net effect of all this is total uncertainty. Business cannot, unfortunately, invest in times of uncertainty, and he has actually contributed to his own uncertainty by spiking up tariffs and then next calling them off, or at least for a period of time. And in this way, he is actually defeating his own policies. In other words, through bad tactical decisions, he's vitiating whatever strategic vision he had. It is very important now for him to come out clearly with his strategy, stick to it, and not in particular but blame President Biden, which is irrelevant at best.
Absolutely. It comes off as a lack of accountability because, like you said, it's been 100 days. And when there's such unpredictability, he needs to pick a side. I mean, there's news every day out of China, new trade agreements, etc., etc. Well, we'll be keeping an eye out on that, and I'm sure you will too as well. Given the tension, still on China, given the tension with China and the escalating, ever-changing import duties, are we seeing any signs of a long-term structural damage to American supply chains or global trade partnerships?
Yes, not long-term damage, but not as bad as it is made out. There's always been change. Please note, many of these countries screaming about American tariffs have their own tariffs. It's not as if they didn't have any tariffs. Moreover, America has had tariffs in the past. It's actually J.F. Kennedy which made the big decision back in '67. The real problem, I think, with Trump is that he's operating in a vacuum. His economics advisors, whatever they are not very good and not helping him. And all the other academics are, of course, hostile, to say the least. So unfortunately, he's going by the seat of his pants. And the net effect of this is that although change does happen, it is bad for global trade because it's not clear precisely what he is doing. It is very important for him to clarify. As for China, China can make up some of the shortfall by going to other markets, but it's not the same as the American market, as it well knows. And so, therefore, presumably both sides will eventually talk. The problem is how much damage they'll do to global trade before they sit down at the negotiating table.
Why do you think it's been so difficult for Trump to articulate consistently his economic vision for the US? What do you think could be the problem?
The reason, in my opinion, is because during his first term, he did have people in his administration who would criticize him or point him out or stop some of his policies, and he didn't like that. So this time he's chosen yes men. The problem with yes men is, although he can get things done, that is the advantage, by the way, and it's a very important one. The problem is he has no one to, so to speak, either rein him in or at least criticize. I mean the word criticize, by the way, in its correct sentence. I do not mean condemn. I mean simply provide him with a critical framework. And the net effect of this is that he, unlike J.F. Kennedy, who I mentioned, who had this economist called Galbraith, a very good economist, by the way, to help him, he has got no one. And therefore, he's, so to speak, out of his depth. And this is the main reason why he literally cannot cope. Economics is a difficult subject. It is not easy. And being a businessman is a help, but it is not sufficient. Some of his ideas, the trade imbalance writing it, and the government spending are okay as a strategy, but his implementation has not been good.
So seeing as the populace has lost confidence in the Trump administration as far as the economic situation is concerned, do you think there is an indication that the Trump administration is adjusting its approach in response to this public anxiety, or is the administration doubling down despite the economic unease?
It is quite clear that it has changed its mind. And the reason is nothing to do with the polls, because they show, and quite accurately, what the people are feeling. The key point is, what does the market say? It is when the bonds started to collapse, the bonds market, the confidence in the American government by the money man was lacking, that he did change his mind. He called off the immediate implementation of the tariffs. And so this is the key one. So although you have pointed out the 66%, the real question, keep an eye on the stock market, keep an eye on the bonds market, especially because that's where the American government borrows and has to borrow because it's running at a loss. And therefore, it's these which are going to be the decisive factors. As things stand, if he does not give a clear policy, they may start to crumble. And that will be the real test of what he's going to do then. He has to really think through his economics policy and do so quickly. What the 66% is showing is that it's, if you like, a harbinger that if he doesn't get his act together, there will be a serious loss of confidence. And incidentally, the American government cannot withstand if the bonds market does not, if it collapses in some way, because without borrowing money, it cannot carry on functioning.
Switch gears now and talk about the personnel in the Trump administration. So you mentioned something very interesting earlier, that he surrounded himself with yes men. Do you think that Marco Rubio is one of those yes men?
Yes, I do. It's quite clear he gets on very well with Marco Rubio. That's why he was selected. There's nothing wrong with that. Marco Rubio appears to be a perfectly competent person. The real problem is he's being overwhelmed with work. What is happening is that he's got rid of Mike Waltz. Okay, well, there were two problems there. The first of all, there's the bungle with the journalist. That's serious. But just to add to the problems, he apparently worked very closely with Netanyahu and far beyond what President Donald Trump wanted him to do. So fair enough, he got rid of him. But to give it all to Marco Rubio, he will overload the man. And one reason why we've heard nothing from Marco Rubio, please remember now, he's been appointed, we've heard nothing, is because I think he's overworked. In my opinion, he should find other people to help out.
Absolutely. You never want to overwhelm someone because you cannot get the best of their efficiency. Now, still on this, is there any precedent for such a concentration of power in one official? Has there ever been anything like this, or is this the first of its kind?
Yes, it has. Kissinger. However, please note, I think Kissinger, on the whole, was in a different league to Marco Rubio. Kissinger had worked in the field of politics, I mean, as an academic and so on, and therefore was in a totally different league in the sense he brought years of experience, albeit not, of course, in these positions. Marco Rubio, as far as I can tell, is a friend, but he's neither a professional politician nor a professional academic nor anything. And he cannot master field after field. So although there is a precedent, unfortunately, it is not really a one that is helpful. The clear indication is that Marco Rubio has done nothing seriously good for some time because of this, in my opinion, overwork. Simply grasping each field takes time because this is a different field, different people, different points, different problems, different issues, and different possibilities. So yes, I think president, yes, but not sufficient, and you should do something about this now.
Historically, Marco Rubio has been a bipartisan and he's done work on the Intelligence Committee. Do you think he has changed since joining the Trump administration? And how do you think this has disappointed, or maybe if it hasn't disappointed, his former colleagues?
I think he's perfectly competent, and he has obviously his own views on the matter, which are, of course, that's what he brings to the job. So there's nothing wrong with that. I think he's simply demonstrated that he is a good member of Donald Trump's team. And so from that point of view, that's his successful aspect. Of course, his work has been criticized, but at the end of the day, one of his critics, as you pointed out, is going about the fact there should be no cuts to intelligence. America cannot afford to do everything. It's going through imperial overstretch. It has got a huge trade deficit, a huge government deficit, and somewhere some cuts must be made. Unfortunate, yes, but then it won't be the first country in world history, the British Empire being another example after World War II, which faced very serious funding problems for doing everything it wanted. And in the end, unfortunately, had to retrench. America's facing the same issue now. So far from this comment about Marco Rubio wanting to cut intelligence or anything else he wants to cut being condemnation, I think he's probably on the right lines. The question is, where, how, and how deep to cut, in my opinion.
Okay. So there are reports of reductions to U.S. spy agencies like the CIA. Like reports of job cuts keep coming up, you know, in just Trump's ambition to shrink the government. And in my opinion, this is going to have a very negative long-term effect, considering that there is a reason why there has been that volume of personnel in the first place, and considering America's efficiency historically. Now that he's trying to shrink and reduce the CIA by approximately 1,200, not to preempt your answer, Dr. Marek, but what do you think is going to be the effect, considering that there are rising threats from China, Russia, and possibly Iran as well?
Well, it is quite true that there will be negative effects. That is undeniable. The question is, can America carry on funding at this level? No, that is undeniable. So the only way out of it is to make sure the cuts have as least impact as possible. This is where the constant condemnation of Donald Trump by the media and the academics is absolutely of no use, because it's simply a blanket condemnation. What is needed here is to arrive at a consensus as to which of the intelligence gathering services could be cut off, cut down or reduced without too great a detrimental effect. So there will be some, but done skillfully, it will not be fatal. But, and here comes the problem, we're living in a time of war, Russia, Ukraine. Please note, this is a war which I've said for many, many years in my books could easily escalate into a war like World War III. We are also living in a time of tension between China and Taiwan, again, intelligence services. And even where America is not directly involved, it's indirectly involved because it is such a world power. There's India and Pakistan, who are threatening a nuclear war yet again. All this needs intelligence services. So, as you point out, there is a problem here. They're needed, there's not the money, so there has to be some cuts, but it takes a skillful hand to reduce the negative side to a minimum.
Agree more. Now, do these developments suggest that national security and foreign policy are becoming increasingly politicized under the Trump administration?
I think, to be honest, politics is always in it, even under President Biden and President Trump. I think the word politicized is slightly wrong. What the point is that the goals, if you like, are changing, and the viewpoints, because we're changed from one political, if you like, reality, or President Biden and Democrats, to another one, which is President Donald Trump, a Republican, one might say, although there are other Republicans which don't at all appear to be so supportive of Donald Trump. The point I'm making here is that whenever there is a change, you could argue that it's been politicized, but all that's really happening is you're changing from political view and strategy A to B. So the point is, this is quite normal, and to do with the fact a different administration with different political views is now in power.
Right, let's talk about the war now. President Zelensky says a ceasefire is possible at any moment. So what exactly, in your opinion, is stopping this? What leverage does Kyiv and its allies really have over Moscow right now?
None. The point is, President Zelensky keeps going on about this, and he keeps on wanting Russia pressurized. The fact of the matter is, there is no pressure. There's only one country in the world that can pressurize Russia, and that is America. There are no other countries. And even America is limited because Russia is a nuclear superpower. China can't be pressurized either, nor can America. That's why if America chooses to walk out of a climate agreement, it can do so. So can Russia. What President Zelensky has a knack for is constantly going on about how Russia must come and agree to his terms, when, to be honest, there is no possibility of Russia agreeing to his terms any more than he is agreeing to Russia's terms. For example, the 3-day ceasefire, which President Putin has proposed, has been rejected by President Zelensky. President Zelensky's 30-day ceasefire has been rejected by President Putin. And no amount of so-called pressure from Europe, because that's the only people you can really go to, is going to change Russia's approach.
Okay, so speaking about NATO countries, Czech president stood behind Zelensky in calling for more pressure. What concrete steps could countries like the Czech Republic or others in the NATO take to increase that pressure?
Okay, you have to distinguish here between Europe, the EU, and NATO. NATO as it stands is a dead duck because its a key member, America, is simply not interested. So therefore, we're talking about the European Union. Well, they keep doing this. They keep piling on the sanctions. But please note, on the first day of the war, back there in 2022, I said that sanctions were next to ineffectual and that all that Ukraine needed was arms. The key point is that Europe as such can neither supply the arms that America is supplying, nor can apply any sort of pressure. And unfortunately, a lot of what the Europeans are saying is waffle. That's all it amounts to. It's of no real effect. Far more dangerous is the fact that Russia has taken to building military bases on the Finnish border and has quite openly stated that Finland and Sweden are now targets because they've joined NATO. Far more dangerous is the fact that Russia constantly is going on about the Suwalki corridor. Please note that in the same way as the land bridge from Russia to Crimea was one of Putin's key goals, so is this corridor. These are very dangerous places. But as for putting pressure on Putin by means of some sort of more sanctions, it's going to go nowhere. And in any case, it's not the key point because it's America which is such an important market. So therefore, it's just more waffle, really.
Now, with such uncertainty in the air, there is a possibility that this war will drag on past its third year. And if this happens, what are the risks for Ukrainian morale, Western unity, and the broader security architecture of Europe?
First of all, Ukrainian morale. It seems to be holding up. But of course, as wars drag on, it all depends on Ukrainians' morale, what Russia can achieve. The capture of Pokrovsk, for example, would be a blow. If it started winning more territory, that's when we see Ukrainian morale tested. Until that moment, I think it'll hold up. As for European security, as I've stated, it will be a question of the Suwalki corridor, according to my analysis in my books, and also the war, because Europe is said to be preparing for it. According to my analysis, it will be time for a nuclear war. The reason why President Putin has used no nuclear bombs in Ukraine is because he regards Ukraine, like the Baltic states, as part of Russia, so to speak, differently shaped Russians. Nothing like that is for in Poland, which is going to be the most likely place. Therefore, the danger is not only of a geographical escalation, but of a qualitative escalation, phase 4, as I call it. So therefore, the security architecture must address these, but it isn't. All Europe's going on about is this thought about training troops, and also something about it's going to try and mimic Elon Musk's star system, the idea of the satellite intelligence gathering system. But about the troops is the first one. It's as if we're back in the 20th century. You know the well-known joke about generals always fighting the last war? Well, that's what Europe's doing. So really, it has to buck up and face the fact the 21st century may be different. And above all, it has to face the fact that Russia can go further, this time in Europe, with this nuclear option.
Thank you very much, Dr. Marek, for joining me once again on Arise America, and of course, for your very insightful analysis. I wish you a good evening.